without further ado, let's go right ahead and get into the first segment, which is about the Southeastern Division and the Southeastern Division teams. Now, obviously, a lot of these teams, there's going to be a lot of questions surrounding these teams. Now, some teams are going to have bigger questions than others. Some teams might actually have more than one big question than the other. But we're going to go over all of those teams. First team we're going to talk about is the Atlanta Hawks. Now, the Hawks, they recently traded away DeJounte Murray over to the Pelicans, and what they got in return was a little bit underwhelming. Like, I would have expected the Hawks to at least try to include Brandon Ingram in the trade package if they were going to send DeJounte over to New Orleans, but they didn't. And because they didn't include him in that trade package, they got rather mediocre players in return and a mediocre pick in return. And that's just the thing. Like, you're trading away DeJounte Murray, who's way above the skill level of a mediocre player, for mediocrity. Like, that doesn't help your team at all. Then again, it's not like DeJounte was really helping the team all that much either. The Trae Young and DeJounte Murray experiment, I should say, excuse me. So now the big question going forward is the era of Trae Young on the Hawks going to come to a close? Given how Trae Young, he wants to win. He's a competitor, and he said it several times. He said it on podcasts. He said it on interviews. He always wants to win. He would love to win in Atlanta, but if he can't win in Atlanta, he would consider opening his options to other teams and playing for other teams. Now, that's obviously, if you're a Hawks fan, that's a little bit concerning because Trae Young is arguably it's the star player of your team, and you definitely need him if you want to compete for a title. Now, whether he's good enough to be a first option, I'm not entirely sure. I think a second option on a team is definitely like his role for him, even though he could totally like play the first option. It's just, I think it would be much better off if he was a second option on a team, and similar to how Damian Lillard would be a second option to Giannis Antetokounmpo, like something like that. And really, like, they got rid of the whole experiment with Murray, so it shows that they're committed to Trae Young. But it's, if they can't acquire the good enough pieces to convince Trae Young to stay on the Hawks, then it might be over for them. And I mean, the Hawks, they've been, ever since that one sort of finals, Eastern Conference Finals appearance that they got to in 2021, they have never really come close to that same level of success in the postseason. And that's if you're Trae Young, obviously that's going to be rather frustrating because you are constantly putting up these 25 plus, 10 plus stat lines, 25 plus points, 10 plus assist stat lines, and your team is still stuck in mediocrity. Now, what are the teams that Trae Young might actually consider going to? Not entirely sure. That's a completely different conversation. But if the Hawks overachieved this year, this question is probably going to get pushed further down the line. But if the losses start to pile up early and quickly for the Hawks, then the focus might shift towards developing the young core as opposed to settling with Trae Young. So this could either push, the fact that the Hawks would want to center on their young core, this might push Trae Young away, who is right now trying to, be in a competing spot for a title, since all of his peers are now in a competing spot for a title. Well, most of his peers. Now, next team on this list is the Charlotte Hornets. They are another team in the in the Southeastern Division, and we have to figure out exactly if Melo can even stay healthy. That's really the big question for this team, and for a lot of, because LaMelo was drafted number 3 overall. He was a great player. Like, when he plays, he's phenomenal. Some people might even argue that his offensive game is better than his brother Lonzo's, who's been in the NBA for a pretty long time. But a common trait about both of those players, Lonzo and LaMelo, is that they both get injured a lot. Like it's a very, very common thing for them to get injured. And that's going to be the biggest question for Charlotte, because in my opinion, if Charlotte continues to have, if Charlotte has the, how should I say, the same young core that they have paired up with LaMelo, and if they're able to develop LaMelo without having to constantly worry about his injuries, I feel like they could be a really good and a really competitive team in the NBA. Again, this is all just dependent on if Melo is healthy. Melo has barely been able to be healthy. Same thing applies with his brother. Like, they're just so unhealthy in every single season. And he hasn't even eclipsed 60 plus games played in the last 2 years. But when he played 75 games his sophomore season, the Hornets made the play-in round and were on the verge of capturing the East's final playoff spot. So when they have LaMelo, they're a very not a very good team, but a decent team, and a team that could show you some flashes of excellence. But without Melo, then they're just unable to do that. And I really think that that's going to be their big question. Next team on the list, and we are a little bit short on time, so I might speed it up just a bit. Next team on this list is the Miami Heat. And the biggest question that's been going on for the entirety of the offseason, if you guys have been paying attention to the podcast, is if Jimmy Butler is either going to get traded or if Jimmy Butler is going to leave. Actually, wait, no. We know Jimmy Butler is planning on going into free agency. The question is if Jimmy Butler is going to get traded, because everyone knows that Jimmy's probably going to try to be a free agent. But Miami, knowing that, they're not going to want to just, let him walk. They're going to try and secure assets for themselves, so that way they can use those assets to thus make the roster a bit better and maybe get something out of letting Jimmy Butler walk. And obviously they don't want to make the same mistake of the Clippers, where they just let Paul George walk without any issue. And I think that's sort of like where the question of is Jimmy Butler going to get traded comes from. So next team on this list is the Orlando Magic. Orlando Magic. So the big question for Orlando is, will they have enough three-point shooting? That was a thing that sort of that I've been critiquing them about. Like, their three-point shooting, some of the players on their squad aren't really consistent three-point shooters, and when you don't have consistent three-point shooters in this league, it makes it all that much more difficult to win a game. So they really needed to. I think Franz Wagner is going to be a very, very solid shooter for the Orlando Magic. And KCP also, they acquired KCP in free agency. He's another very good shooter. So now the Magic just have to sort of put this into practice and see if they legitimately can be a solid three-point shooting team. And finally, the worst team, arguably the worst team in the NBA right now, the Washington Wizards, or the worst team in the NBA last season. Again, arguably. And the biggest question that they have for this season is this season going to be as bad as last season? Yes, that is the question that we got for them. Because, to be fair, that last season was awful. Everybody thought that Jordan Poole was going to be just this phenomenal player on a bum team. Like, they thought he was going to drop, and I say bum team because it's a non-competing team. That's sort of what you call those teams when they're not in a spot to compete. They're bottom-feeding teams. So the Jordan Poole, he was traded, not traded over. He signed with a bottom-feeding team, and usually the expectation is when a good player signs with a team that has little expectations, that good player is going to just go off and play phenomenally. Everybody thought that before the Washington Wizards season started that Jordan Poole was going to average 28 or 29 or 30 on 20 shot attempts. Everybody thought that he was going to be some sort of fantastic offensive talent, and that ultimately amounted to nothing. And that rolled over into the rest of the Washington Wizards and the roster, because Jordan Poole plays with a sort of I don't really care attitude. And That's sort of what I see from him, and that's sort of what I see from a lot of the other players on Washington. It feels like they play for themselves as opposed to playing for the win. And obviously, when you play for yourself, you're just never, ever, ever going to win in the NBA. So that's all I have for this first segment. So now I will go ahead and go into the second segment where I talk about potential landing spots for Brandon Ingram right after this short break. So be sure to stay tuned.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift. Oh, I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the